So welcome everybody, and it's lovely to have you all here this evening. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Ruth Gledhill and I'm the online editor of The Tablet, and it's a real honour to be here tonight chairing this webinar. We're delighted to have so many of you with us, and this is the second in our series of 4 conversations about the common good. First, just a few housekeeping points. This is a webinar rather than a Zoom meeting, so you will be delighted to hear that we can't see you, but you can see and hear us. So feel free to join us while eating your dinner, doing your washing up, lying on the sofa, swimming in the pool, wherever you are and whatever you're doing, you really are most welcome. Please do use the chat. It would be great to see who's here in the chat. Introduce yourselves there, say where you're from, your name, your organisation and so on. And do share your thoughts with us about what's happening and what we're talking about. Feel free to use it throughout, but of course, obviously keep your comments friendly and civil. We would love you to put questions to our panel. Please do use the Q&A function, and I'll keep an eye on that and select questions for the panel depending upon which are the most upvoted. Do add your name and organisation when asking a question, although you can ask anonymously if you prefer, because I know some people do. And as I said, you can vote. So that is how we will know which questions you would most like to be addressed. So now let's get going. Welcome everybody to the common good. What does it mean for families, for civil society, and for government? This is a series of 4 conversations between now and November. As our country faces complex challenges ahead, we've assembled a really interesting group of speakers to help us explore the meaning and importance of the common good and the responsibility it places on families, society, and the state. This series of 4 conversations is brought to you by a coalition of 4 organisations: Together for the Common Good, the Centre for Social Justice, Caritas Social Action Network, the Benedict XVI Centre for Religion and Society at St Mary's University. And we're delighted that the series is supported by CCLA, one of the UK's largest ethical fund managers and home of the New Catholic Investment Fund. This evening, our second event is looking specifically at the common good. What does it mean for the family? First of all, what is the common good? Well, in our first event, and if you haven't seen it, you can still watch it on the St Mary's YouTube account. We explored in that event that in its true sense, the common good relates to the shared life of a society. We learned it's not a utopian ideal, but a settled pluralism of identities and interests. We saw that at the heart of the common good is relationship building across estranged interests and balancing power between market, state and civil society. We saw how, in a time of great uncertainty and with complex challenges ahead, the common good calls us all into a vision of civic renewal. It requires not only the state to play its part, but also every layer of society too, from individuals and families to associations, businesses, local and regional bodies. Each must fulfil their unique vocational responsibility for the common good. This evening, we're going to focus on what this means for the family. Now, I think we can all agree that the family contributes massively to the common good. I was going to say immeasurably, but from our panellists tonight, all experts in this field, we will hear some convincing empirical evidence as to why this is so as well. Our families come in all shapes and sizes. Some are fragile, and we all face difficult challenges from time to time. Yet the family is the fundamental foundation upon which the common good is built. Yet often social and economic policy and rhetoric focuses on the individual. And evidence shows that this individualistic approach can create conditions that in fact weaken family life. So continuing from our first event, and ahead of our next 2 events, which look at the role of society and of government, our panel this evening will consider the responsibility of the family in building the common good and what kinds of conditions our families need to fulfil their critical role. So now I'm delighted to introduce our panel. Edward Hadas is a research scholar at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, as well as a fellow at the Institute of Human Ecology, Catholic University of America, and a visiting senior fellow for the School of Management and Social Sciences, St. Mary's, Twickenham. Educated at Columbia University, Oxford, and the State University of New York at Binghamton, he worked for many years as a financial analyst and then as a journalist, mostly at Reuters Breaking Views, but also for 1 year as assistant editor of the Lex column of the Financial Times. His book, Counsels of Imperfection, Thinking Through Catholic Social Teaching, was published by Catholic University of America Press 2 years ago. Human Goods, Economics Evils, A Moral Approach to the Dismal Science was published by ISIS in 2007. Cristina Odone and I go back quite a way. Cristina joined the Centre for Social Justice as head of Family Policy Unit in March 2020. She's the co-author of the CSJ briefing on domestic violence during lockdown and author of the CSJ report on family hubs in school settings. Prior to joining the CSJ, Cristina founded the Parenting Circle charity, which she chairs. She's the author of several research reports published by the Centre for Policy Studies on issues ranging from faith schools to women's employment choices. Her audiobook, Talk, Read, Play, 25-minute parenting to connect with your children at any age, is published by Audible. Concentrated Parenting, 7 Key Moments in the Lives of Children, is published by Amazon. A journalist and broadcaster, Cristina sits on the external advisory panel of the University of Oxford's Faculty of Theology and Religion. And Mercy Muroki, writer, commentator, and presenter at GB News. She's a trustee at the Museum of Home. Until recently, she was a senior researcher at the Centre for Social Justice and a commissioner on the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. She is the woman who David Goodhart said of to Cristina Odone just a few minutes ago, she is going to be PM, Prime Minister, in 10 years' time. Mercy is currently studying for a Master's in Social Policy at Jesus College, Oxford. So that is our panel. The way this is going to work is at first we're going to hear from our speakers, about 5 minutes each. Then we'll dig into a question and answer session. We'll have about and a discussion among our speakers. That will go on for about half an hour. And then after that, it will be your turn to ask questions. And it'll be a broad discussion between the panel, responding to all of your questions. So we'll start with Edward, who will speak for about 5 minutes. Then we'll move on to Cristina, and then Mercy will follow through at the end. Is that okay, Mercy? Fantastic. So, Edward.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for the helpful introduction. I have a prepared little talk here, which I will now read. It starts with a comment that this is really something that Ruth started with, which is that few people will come out and say, you know what, I care about me. I don't really care about the well-being of children and families. There may be a Guardian opinion piece that comes pretty close to that, but most people in Britain or in anywhere really would claim to care a great deal about the next generation. And that's not an empty claim. At the individual level, I would say most children have at least one parent, almost all children have at least one parent who is seriously committed to raising them well. And socially, all governments in the modern world dedicate significant resources to the education of the young and their health care. And most of them have very large bureaucracies for what they might call child protection. And yet, I claim, and I'm thinking here along with the Catholic Church, that we speaking as individuals and we as a society actually do very little to support the families in which almost all children live. See why I say that? Try and thought experiment. Suppose that we really did treat strong families as key supports of the common good, that is, of the shared and enduring flourishing of each of us and all of us in a community. Suppose we thought of families as not only the natural formers of children and their first teachers of behavior, morals, and religion, but also as the primary repositories of social traditions, as the preferred carers for old people, as schools for love, sacrifice, and dedication. If we thought of families in that elevated way, how would we behave? Very differently, I think, than the way that we do this than we do now. If our slogans were children first and families first, I think as individuals, society would encourage us to behave very differently. I'll give a little list. We would encourage early marriages and younger mothers so that parents would be healthier, more energetic, and less distracted by their well-established careers. We would encourage extended families in which parents have support from relatives and children typically grow up with some sort of cousins. We would teach young people that sexual love should be faithful and, here I'm going to sound very Catholic, should be directed towards procreation. And we would discourage, not take pride in, all emotional and sexual orientations and arrangements that tend in a way to damage or just to denigrate the way that we have families and children. And finally, we would discourage an attitude of, my child must have everything. That sort of approach to consumption creates a spurious sense of material poverty that saps the spiritual wealth of family life. That's for individuals. Politically, we would ensure that tax codes, labor laws, and planning systems made children as economically rewarding for their families as they are beneficial for the common good. What do I mean in detail? Well, it's a long story, but the agenda would include living wages, what used to be called family wages, negative income taxes for parents, subsidies for childcare whether it was offered by the child's own family or by outsiders. And my own personal suggestions, we should give all children the vote. If they're too young to exercise it themselves, let their parents vote for them. That would change the political balance in favor of families. Now, I say all that, and the time comes quickly if someone, my Guardian reader, might say, or New York Times, that I've confused two things. I've confused a faulty right-wing oppressive notion of family first, family values, with a really important idea, says the Guardian reader, of children first. In this view, families are optional, traditional families, as we might say. They're optional for promoting the good of children. And of the common good of society. Indeed, they will say, often these people will say, governments, the modern welfare states can ensure that children are put first. And with that backstop for the kids, then we adults can have more freedom to work on our own individual fulfillment in matters of career, love, and sexuality. And as a bonus, that fulfillment might lead to alternative good models for child rearing. Okay, they're just wrong. They're wrong about alternative child rearing models, as my co-panelists are about to demonstrate. They're equally wrong about the proper role of government. As was discussed in the first of these roundtables, the common good is neither the good of the state, nor is it primarily the responsibility of the state, of the government. Welfare states can support, but they cannot replace what children need most, the loving protection and guidance of their parents and relatives, their families. Sure, governments can and should support families. I just gave you a list, but they should stay as far in the background as possible. The more that governments try to take charge of defining and enforcing the common good, the less they can actually promote it. And the reason for that is simple. To be truly common, the common good cannot be mandated by the decisions of rulers, even by rulers, or especially by rulers who think of themselves as enlightened technocrats. The common good has to be found primarily by the common folk and their common communities. And that community starts with the most natural of human communities, the family.
Thank you, Edward. That was really interesting, and I got so caught up in typing, I failed to notice that you'd finished. And I thought it was really interesting, your last point that you built up to, that the common good can't be mandated, but must come from the common units of society, such as a family. And as I understand, your deeper point is that the problem is emanating from this culture of individualism, and that what's gone wrong is damaging family and our civic society, and the common good is the way forward to that. Now, we're going to move on to Cristina now. And Cristina is I understand, going to back some of this up with lots of data points and add new information of her own. Cristina.
I'm not sure I'm going to add so much information, but I was very struck. And Edward, I think I might steal this sentence of yours. The state can support but not supply what children need. And I think that's absolutely brilliant. And as I said, I'm a magpie, so I'll steal that one. I'm delighted to join this really important conversation, and especially with in the company of Ruth, whom I've known and admired for many years, and of an academic at Catholic University of America, as well as Blackfriars, and of course a future prime minister. I mean, what better company in which to discuss the common good? But it's not a rare term of discussion for me, because the ideal of the common good animates the work that the Center for Social Justice carries out. We see ourselves as policy advocates, and this is our agenda, one that sees everyone flourishing, not just the most fortunate, but also the most disadvantaged. It's an agenda that has, as we've heard from all the speakers in this session and in the earlier sessions, has relationships at its heart. It recognizes that the individual is not only sacred and unique, but also social and connected. And where better for this ideal to play out than in the family? As Edward has already said, the family is a blueprint for all relations. Or, to quote Pope Francis, the family is the nearest hospital, the first school for the young, the best home for the elderly. It is also the most powerful engine for the common good. Supporting the family and encouraging its formation are the key elements of a social contract between the polis and individual citizens. But for decades now, some might say for centuries now, that social contract has been framed. Can we honestly say that society, and more specifically the state, supports the family, allowing its members to flourish? We cannot. The state places the individual, not the family, center stage. It's now all about me, not we. The state prizes individuals as consumers and taxpayers rather than as parents. It has made divorce easier and quicker to obtain. It has failed to support families that seek to look after their most vulnerable, the very ill, the very old. Having a family no longer counts for much. As a family member, little is expected of you and little is given to you. The result? Families are breaking up and breaking down, leaving in their wake generations of alarming statistics. As the CSJ has shown, a child whose family breaks down before they turn 18 is twice as likely to be abusing substances, suffer poor mental health, and end up homeless. They're almost twice as likely to end up in debt or in jail. It's a catalog of horrors, not to mention of costs, and it's explained by neuroscience. The study of attachment, of adverse childhood experiences, of trauma, all show that our brain is a social organ. Its functioning is dictated by caring connections. It's malfunctioning by neglect and abuse. Science, as well as sense, suggests that in seeking the common good, the state should invest in the one place where a nexus of positive relationships can be forged. Think of the unhappiness spared, the money saved, the votes won, if we could support the family as a simple social enterprise. So what can we do? How can we become a more family-friendly Britain? I have 3 policies for change. Each one aims to rattle the materialist view of individuals, society, and the common good that seems to prevail in Westminster. And the first, like Edward, is about tax, changing our tax system. But in my view, what we should do is tax parents on their combined income, offer them tax credits for each child. With this one move, the government would be sending out a message. We recognize the value of the family and the important role parents play in forming the next generation. It would make parenting and work more compatible. And it would recognize the household economy of care, that unpaid domestic work that brings enormous benefit to families and communities. The move would not only be in accordance with the social justice agenda, but it would also be popular with voters. According to the DFE Childcare Early Year Survey, 1/3 of mothers would like to be at home full time, and 57% would rather work fewer hours in order to spend more time with their children. My second idea is about community. Many of us will have experienced the children's centers that were very much part of the New Labour agenda. But they focused on early years rather than the whole age range that a family comprises. They focused on babies and toddlers and had no room for grandparents, for older siblings, or indeed for many parents. It was to extend the reach of the Children's Center that the CSJ in 2004 drafted a plan for something called the Family Hub. These were supposed to be local centers catering for couples and their children and grandparents too. And almost 20 years on, the Conservative Party manifesto has decided that yes, family hubs are here and they should be rolled out. I would suggest this decision should be accelerated, and the network of already, there's about 150 family hubs, they should be expanded as quickly as possible. Because with the Family Hub, we have a one-stop shop for statutory and voluntary services that can really strengthen families. They can include couples counseling, they can include breastfeeding advice, they can include housing, debt advice. And sadly, also, they can signpost you to domestic abuse support, to substance abuse support. We could even move, here's an idea, the marriage and birth registrations from the formality of the town hall to an intimate center, a community center where more personal conversations can be held. And because they have one door, we avoid the stigma and prompt people to come through. My final suggestion is about parenting support, which doesn't surprise anybody who knows me, because I believe that family life is very much focused on parenting, and parenting, although it can bring so much joy and enhance your life, is also difficult, can be lonely, can be confusing, and we have seen that especially during the pandemic. So why don't we invest in parenting programs that offer some guidance and that network the men and women who are parenting with a shared experience? I don't know. Parenting class provision is patchy at best. The standard offer is short-term. Can we really embed new good habits and forge new good relationships in 10 weeks? I don't think so. But government has been traditionally loath to enter this intimate space. What happens in a home is seen as private, as something we shouldn't even know about. But when you find out that 98% of children in care are there not because of their misbehavior or afflictions, but because of their parents' needs. When parenting is defined as the number one determinant of a child's outcomes, even more than that child's socioeconomic background, then surely we should recognize that supporting positive parenting is crucial. We can't let parenting sit there isolated in a bubble within four walls. This has to become a public health issue that needs all the messaging and the nudging that we invested in getting people to buckle their seatbelts, stop smoking, stop drinking, stop driving. So, 3 very concrete policies, relatively easy and inexpensive for the government to take on board. Will they? Will the government have the foresight to see that a parent who brings up a child benefits society more than one who holds down a job? Will it have the imagination to see that family hubs can become a building block of local communities? And will it have the gumption to ignore the ideological boogeyman that says family's off limits for anybody in politics? Or will it join the many, many regimes that have failed the family, from Plato's imagined republic to the very real dictates of Marxism? Even some of the church fathers viewed the family unit with suspicion. Celibacy, according to St. Paul, was far superior to couples. I don't know whether the occupants of Downing Street today are wiser than St. Paul, or of Plato indeed, but I do think there's a subversive quality in RPM, and here's an opportunity to overturn the materialist mission of the bien-pensants by embracing instead the sacred, the spiritual, and the loving nucleus that is the family.
Thank you, Cristina. Well, what an image you unfolded at the end there. And oh, wouldn't it be wonderful if that could become the case? I was shocked by that statistic that you quoted, that 90% of children in care are there because of their parents' needs.
98%.
98%, that's just incredible. And I was also rather astounded by, your statement that it would be an inexpensive thing to do, to implement these measures, a relatively inexpensive thing. And of course, that's not the message we get all the time. We're led to believe that it would be prohibitively expensive, and this is why it doesn't happen. But really, there's no excuse not to do all this. Mercy, if we could move on to you now. And I know that you have an interest in family structures in different communities, and might have something to say about the integrity of single parents, the importance of extended family networks, and the role of fathers and couple relationships, as well as parenting. And over to you now. I'd be interested.
Well, thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. Much of what I'm going to say is not going to be surprising. It's been echoed by the speakers before me, which have been tough acts to follow, are going to be tough acts to follow, but I will do my best. For me, it's undeniable families are the building block of society, which has been a relatively uncontroversial thing to say for a while, I think, until recently, or so it seems. I do feel the family as a unit has somewhat come under attack, but it is the case that when families are flourishing, society is flourishing. I think those two things are inextricably linked, and ergo family is fundamental for the common good. And family ties have never been as important as they are today, particularly for people of my generation, I feel. And why is this? Why young people are staying at home more than ever before. They're relying on their family for support in a way that they perhaps weren't in previous generation for a larger proportion of their life. Over the last 2 decades alone, there's been a nearly 50% increase in the number of young people living with their parents. So that just gives you an idea of how fundamental family is becoming at later stages of adolescence. We've also just experienced, of course, the greatest disturbance to our way of life in peacetime, and home has been virtually for everybody, or the big chunk of people who had to stay at home, has been the only option. So family and the home has taken on a sort of renewed meaning during coronavirus and during lockdown. So I think it's a very apt time to be examining what the family means. And as Cristina mentioned, it's brought out some the negative sides as well, because Cristina will be the first to tell you about the stats around children going into care, for example, because the dysfunction within some families has very much been brought to the fore. Those with supportive families have been probably able to stay sane, and we know that the children of families who have been stable and who have a good range of means at their disposal to look after their children properly have done better than those families who haven't got that, and they've sort of been pushed further down the pecking order as a result of the pandemic. And I think family as a concept, as an ideal, is facing somewhat of a crisis. Just to give you a few figures, the number of abortions was at a record high last year, since records began, with nearly 211,000 abortions recorded. The average age of starting a family, as was alluded to earlier, has been climbing for decades. It's at 29 for women at the moment, and the number of divorces as well is increasing. Number of divorces in England and Wales alone saw its largest increase in nearly 50 years, and we know that nearly half of all marriages are now ending in divorce. And aside from that, I think culturally the family is facing a crisis. It's come under attack, mainly I think from people on the left, or people who might describe themselves as progressive, because it is now being seen as a more archaic concept. And of course, I think it's right that we appreciate and accept all manner of families. Families come in all different shapes and sizes, and no family should be disrespected because of the structure that they have. But at the same time, I think particularly as a young woman, I think a lot of young women are now being sold this idea that actually having babies, it's bad for the environment. It's quite selfish if you have babies. I think we saw Meg and Harry being rewarded the other day for just having 2 children, whereas we should be doing the opposite and encouraging young women to have more children. And there's also a great inequality when it comes to family, particularly, as you mentioned, Ruth, across different ethnicities. I sat on the government's Commission for Race and Ethnic Disparities, and we were particularly concerned when we looked at all the data with how much family breakdown plays a role in explaining disparities you see between ethnicity. It's another piece of the puzzle that once you understand the disparities in terms of family structures within ethnicities, they almost map on perfectly to the outcomes you see across, particularly for children, across the different ethnicities. So, for example, this is a particularly shocking statistic. 63% of Black Caribbean children in Britain are growing up in lone parent families, 63% in 2020. That's compared to 6% of Indian children. So we're talking 63% compared to 6%. So, and then society sort of asks itself, why is it that Caribbean kids are doing so poorly in education and Indian kids are thriving? I mean, I'd say it's not a coincidence that these family structures and these figures are the case. It's not a coincidence that we see the children performing the way they are. Class also comes to this. Cristina and the Centre for Social Justice Research into Family has highlighted that middle-class families are more likely to get married, less likely to experience family breakdown, and more likely, therefore, to reap the benefits that comes with sort of appreciating that, family and a stable family unit is really one of the keys to success in life. Now, I don't profess to sort of have all the answers to how civil society and public policy can help families flourish, but I come from speaking from a background of a wealth of sort of experiences, a lot of adverse experiences when it comes to the family. So this concept of family, for me, it's been one I've almost grappled with across my life because of my own experiences. I came from a typical working class immigrant background. I'm a first generation immigrant, came to this country when I was 5 years old. And my upbringing has what some would say are all the hallmarks of familial dysfunction. I was raised by my single mother, who was sort of made single because of being a victim of domestic abuse. as a result of the sort of chaos that ensued from that experience, what ended up happening was my sister became pregnant as a teenager while she was doing her GCSEs, because those things happen when, you know, there's a family dysfunction. You can sort of trace back those sorts of outcomes, I think, to an often dysfunctional family. And then I myself became a single mother at the age of 18. So I've had quite the journey in relation to how I see family, how I feel about the concept of family. But nonetheless, ideologically speaking, I still think, you know, family is incredibly fundamental and is the single best thing I think a society can revere, this concept of the family. And, you know, I hate to say it, but some of you might remember a few years ago when Andrea Leadsom and Theresa May were running to be a Conservative leader and thus Prime Minister. Andrea Leadsom had to drop out of the race because she said, which was found to be controversial, that she had a better stake in society than Theresa May, or she had more of a stake in the future of the country because she was a mother. People found this very distasteful. It perhaps was because Theresa May can't have children, sadly. So it was distasteful, but I think she had a point, because for me, that's been my experience. I think I would say I've done more growing up since I became a mother at 18 than I did in the 18 years prior to that. What I mean by that is I've done a lot more reflection about society, a lot more reflection about my community. I was quite individualistic. I was quite selfish, you know, as many teenagers are. And when I had a child, I started to look at what my responsibilities or my duties to other people. Suddenly I felt I had this, you know, fundamental stake in the future, and I very much cared what my surroundings and my community and my society looked like. And so I think understanding the value of the family and not just blindly focusing on individuals is crucial to society. For me, because, you know, to paraphrase Edmund Burke, it does make you feel part of the tapestry of those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are yet to be born. That's very much how I feel. So what can the government do? Well, Cristina has very eloquently pointed out all the great policy solutions that the government can and should take forward. I think fertility policy is so important. We know we have an aging population. We're having fewer children. We're having children in later life. The government needs to encourage young women in particular. Let's not beat around the bush. It needs to be younger women. I know as a society we're sort of almost encouraging. We saw Naomi Campbell, for example, have a baby at 50, and that's great, but we still need to be encouraging younger women to have children and making that actually practically possible. Because I think a lot of the reason why families seems like having a family seems so far out of reach for so many young people is because the practicality of it. I mean, childcare is ridiculously expensive anyway. Buying a house for young people is more difficult than it ever has been. There's so many practicalities that go around sort of facilitating families that the government has not got right. I think social care also forms a really important part of this. When we think of families, we sort of think of just sort of a mother, a father, and children. Social care is fundamental to this because I come from a culture, I'm Kenyan, and looking after your elders, particularly in a lot of global South cultures, I would say, is a matter of honour and pride. And I feel like as a third party observer in this country, and this is something a lot of my relatives comment on, it's older people are almost seen as a burden that need to be, you know, shipped off to some care home somewhere. That's certainly not the view. You know, my grandmother, who I did count how many living descendants she has. I mean, it's well over 100. She had 10 children, and, you know, they've had many children as well, and so on and so on. I think she's a great, great grandmother at the moment as well. And, you know, she is very much the matriarch of my family. She's the glue that binds it together, and she is treated like a queen pretty much. And she also keeps her local community together. And it's incredible just what one person and one family, the significance they can have for the local community. And also, I mean, we talk about all these policies and family hubs and all these other things, parenting classes. And for me, having come from my background, I can tell you it does really seem like very often feel like a middle class pastime, really, just discussing family hubs and sort of parenting classes and parenting and things like that. Because I know a lot of mums and working class mums, and they simply don't engage with these things. I think we have to be quite blunt. They are not as engaged with parenting policies, parenting policies and various initiatives as more well-off or middle-class parents. I mean, I don't know why that is. Maybe that's something we can discuss, but there's a disengagement with services across many communities, both working class communities and a lot of ethnic minority communities as well. So often it's sort of left to Mumsnet to forge, for mothers to find information and get advice and things. And I don't know where fathers go. I don't know if there's a Mumsnet equivalent for fathers, but there probably isn't. It's probably not that popular. Finally, to conclude, I mean, do I have faith in this particular government to take forward policies? Well, put bluntly, we have a prime minister who won't confess how many children he has, and extramarital engagements seem to have been an activity he likes engaging in, let's put it that way. And we all saw the front page of The Sun a couple of weeks ago, and that minister having what was a very interesting liaison with one of his advisors. So, as Cristina said, she told me that David Goodhart thinks I'll be Prime Minister in 10 years, which is rather ambitious. And I'm not sure I have political ambitions, but if I was Prime Minister, the first thing I would be doing is setting up a department for families to make sure that family runs through the veins of government, and I would be completely unashamed in sort of pushing this idea that it has to be families first, and we need a fertility policy and we need a family policy for the common good.
Thank you so much, Mercy. I'd vote for you. And thank you very much for sharing some of your personal story as well, which really brought the points you were making to life for all of us. And before I ask Edward and Cristina to come back in on some of the interesting points that you and they all raised, I'd just like to ask you about one point you mentioned about young people staying at home more than ever before. And then you also spoke about the value of the extended family. Could it be a good thing that young people are staying at home for longer?
Well, I mean, I don't think it is in these circumstances, let's put it this way. I speak to a lot of young people, and they're frustrated and exacerbated because they feel they have no other option. In my culture, for example, my Kenyan culture, you see being at home as an honor almost. You want to be around your family and you want to do that, and there's almost an element of choice around it. I don't think under the circumstances young people appreciate feeling like they have to be at home. But I mean, I would always encourage sort of intergenerational mixing. So I do think it's great that people have more contact with their parents and grandparents, but probably not in the circumstances we find ourselves in.
Thank you. Edward, if I could just come back to you to come back in for a little bit then and to please discuss these points among yourselves. I'm interested in the points that both Cristina and Mercy made, and you yourself made, and in how these issues around the family relate to the culture wars that we're seeing taking off in America in particular. But could they come here? Some people think they could, and that we're just a few years behind America. What do you think about that? I think you need to unmute, Edward. Sorry.
It's a good question. In a way, the culture wars, the family values wars were now 20 or 30 years ago. In the 1980s, there was a great sort of the Republicans in the US, sort of the pre-war current culture wars. The Republicans stood for family values, and they accused the Democrats, some Republicans, some Democrats, of being opposed to so-called family values. But the hostility to families that all three of us talked about, the sort of implicit social hostility to families has gotten a lot stronger since then. And in a way, it's a little bit disappointing to me how little attention is paid by, say, the side of the culture wars that's opposed to progressivism. I'm not sure what we're going to call it. That's already going to cause trouble to give it a name. How little attention they do pay to families. It's a topic that is almost secondary in sort of complaining about things like Black Lives Matter or wokeism. Whereas one of the kind of central issues in that side of the culture war would be to be opposed to what we might call family values. So I'm afraid that the family as a theme probably has lost salience. We take for granted too much the unfamily nature of society, which is why I started off by giving some rather radical suggestions. I was very happy to hear Mercy and Cristina both sort of talk about how useful it is to have young mothers and the sort of ever creeping up age of first birth is a sign of just how little interested we are in the health and welfare of families, and nothing in the culture wars to me suggests that there's any real interest in that.
Thank you. Cristina, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I sadly agree with Edward that the culture wars have completely sidelined the family. It's not an area of discussion. Coupling is, but and possibly if you have a child who decides that they are not the gender that they were born in, that can become part of the culture wars. But families as a unit are very much sidelined, and I think that is, it is because our individualist, our society, our government, our commerce is all focused on the individual, on me and my. And in the process, we are eroding not only the family, but we are also eroding the community. I mean, one of the Mercy was very brave to talk about fertility policies. And you, Edward, were very brave to talk about young mothers, the importance of having children young. But there is another element that is also rather old-fashioned and unpopular to mention, and that is the way that having women be sucked into professional life or into any job 9 to 5 has disrupted those amazing connections that women used to make within the community. If there was an elderly neighbor who needed to be taken care of, if there was the WI to be a member of, if there was any kind of voluntary organization, used to be animated by women who cared, who stayed home, who raised their children, and then had kind of expanded their horizon to embrace other members of the community. And that's all gone. And that's all because of this materialist perception, this materialist viewpoint, I think.
Thanks, Cristina. Now, we are getting some very good questions in. And if it's okay, I would like to start moving to some questions, and we can, discuss them. And I'd really like to hear the panel's views on this very interesting question from one person here. Paul Butler, Bishop Paul Butler. He's Bishop of Durham and co-chairman of the Archbishop's Families and Households Commission. And he says, is not family about being intergenerational, not simply about where children are best raised? The core of what all human beings need is being loved and cared for, attachment and love in the very earliest years, but also through life. Knowing we are loved and that we belong at all points are key. So what policies can promote intergenerational family life? I know we've touched on this, and I wanted to ask as well, how can we put the family back on the agenda? Mercy, what have you got any thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, I think that is right. And when we talk about intergenerational families, I think the biggest success stories, if you look at ethnic groups in this country, have been Bangladesh. I mean, Indians, we're quite well aware that they have really good outcomes. Some of the most successful ethnic groups in the country, both educationally and occupationally. And Bangladeshi people have also seen their outcomes have, gone off, the trajectory has been, unrivaled over the last 2 decades. And these are the sorts of communities where we see this intergenerational support for each other. So I completely agree that it is about intergenerational support, family support. And, my mum works in a care home, and she looks after some older residents that have no family whatsoever. And, the only time somebody sort of decides to show some care is when they're on their deathbed, basically. And then suddenly you get relatives rushing to basically, put bluntly, see if they're on the will, essentially. And she just describes how sad it is for those, for these childless people who don't have any, they don't see a sense of purpose anymore. They just almost feel like life is just dragging on a bit. And she makes a real distinction between those people and the people who do have their family members visiting them every day. And she's seen it firsthand, and you can't compare the two groups. So that is definitely one aspect of family that we forget often, but we definitely shouldn't.
Edward, is it possible for government policies to promote better family life? Is that actually objectively possible?
Well, there's some things you can do, and we've talked about this. You have some tools. You have tax policy, and you have sort of labor laws that would encourage people to say mothers to take part-time jobs, or pay scales that would allow people, men or women, I suppose, to earn family wages enough to support their family, housing planning and so forth, that would encourage building houses that were large enough for families, and discouraging kind of price inflation that we have that makes owning a house very difficult in this country. And you can see some of this going on. I mean, someone in the chat mentioned the Hungarian family policy, but you're up against something that's very severe. And I think Hungarian birth rate moved up from 1.3 to 1.6 on the basis of probably the single most generous family policies anyone's seen anywhere in the world. You're still well below the replacement rate of 2.1 child per woman. And you're the culture that's anti-family, even when the government is pro-family, is very strong. So, I mean, take something, I can go on for hours, so I won't, pensions. We always think of pensions as liberating, and indeed they are. And it means you don't, as a parent or a non-parent, you don't depend on children, because the state will take care of you. And there's lots to be said in favor of that, but it's a very strong anti-family policy. If your children are expected to take care of you, then if you don't have children, you have a problem. So that encourages you to have children. It also encourages you to be good to your children, because you're going to depend on them in old age. So we can start policies that support families, but one should look at the way the welfare state works and realize that so much of it is actually structured in ways that discourage people from depending on their children, on their parents, on their families. If just one last example, if a parent dies and the child other relatives want to adopt the child, it's often not even automatic that will be approved. You wander through the state apparatus in a way that is very antagonistic to the whole notion of an extended family, of a community from the bottom. So I tend to want the government to do things that I don't think are at all popular if we really wanted them to support families.
Cristina, in your work, you're really at the cutting edge of research and data about these very issues. And can you see, a realistic way forward to changing this, and if so, can you even begin to say what that might be?
Well, I think that one of the important in small policy interventions one could have is a family test, where every single policy that goes through any department has to be looked at with the eyes of what impact will this have on families. So a family test that goes across all the departments would be a very useful quick win. But I also think you're totally right, Edward, that one of the striking aspects of our childcare system is that you can have an aunt living next door, and she's offering to look after your child, and the way that the state is so suspicious of anybody who is going to be taking care of your child. So safeguarding issues arise immediately, and the fact that she is an aunt is absolutely doesn't wash at all. And when as you said, there is a tragedy in the family, whether it's a death or domestic abuse or drug abuse, again and again and again, the state will not automatically think of calling upon the extended family of the child whose life has just been disrupted. So it is as if the family is not taken into consideration as the incredible support network that it really is. So that mentality, I'm not sure that even a family test across all departments could help. I disagree with Mercy completely on the family hubs and the parenting classes, and I'll tell you why. Since COVID, more and more parents, more and more grandparents have recognized the isolation that they, as well as their children, have been suffering from. And that urge to form small groups, small local groups, to get out of their home has been really, really strong. And I think that if anything has been proved by COVID, is just how social an animal the human being really is.
Thank you, Cristina. Thank you, all of you, for addressing Bishop Butler's points. Now we have a question from Mark Molden here. And I think this moves on nicely from what we've been talking about. And that's CST postures that a well-constructed society will be one that gives priority to the integrity, stability, and health of family life. Now, Mark says, we know families come in all shapes and sizes, but at the root of all our various family types is an intimate adult partnership, the couple relationship. Married or not, together or apart, known or unknown, healthy or unhealthy, fleeting or permanent. That can be an uncomfortable fact and a deeply painful reality for some, but to avoid or airbrush out the couple relationship from family life overlooks a foundational opportunity to build the common good. Family breakdown is a misnomer, relationships break down. Do you agree? And then also for an anonymous attendee, a related question: how do we affirm family structures as a basis of the common good without appearing to stigmatize those whose families do break down? Mercy, could we go back to you to ask you to start on this one, please?
I think it is somewhat perceived as difficult to affirm family structures without being seen to demonize families that have broken down, to use that term. And I'm not hopeful that that balance can be achieved, particularly given the state of public discourse where we're lacking nuance. So sometimes you feel like at the moment you take one position, people think you're simultaneously sort of taking the opposite position, if that makes sense. So somebody thinks if you're saying families are good, then what you're also saying is that people who aren't in stable families are bad. So I think it needs to be done carefully. I think it needs to involve people who have had personal experiences of those things, because I have obviously experienced family breakdown, as I mentioned earlier, and I'm still a huge advocate for family. So perhaps it needs people with my background almost to come out in support of family, so that we're not accused of demonizing sort of people who have experienced family breakdown. And in relation to the couples, I think that is very important. And from a sort of another perspective, a youth perspective, so to speak, it makes me quite sad. Many of you would have heard of the phenomenon that is Love Island. It's a reality TV program. I hadn't watched, I'd avoided it for years, and now that I've sort of been working in the media more, I thought, let me give this thing a go that is watched by millions of people. There has to be something to it. So I've been watching this Love Island, and it makes me very depressed about, if that's the image that of love and couples that young people are being told to aspire to. I mean, it's just, these young people, very materialistic, just switching between couples. It's almost seen as a nothingness, that you just hop from one person to the other, and it's all about who you find most attractive. That I think that's the image young people are sold these days of what being a couple is, rather than all these other things about actually being a couple is a family unit. And it's not about materialism, and it's about love, and it's about all these deeper things. So sadly, I am sounding quite depressing, but I feel quite despondent about the way society is presenting the idea of family and couples.
Edward, thank you very much, Mercy, and that's a really interesting response. So Edward, I wonder if you could take this on, and thinking of what another attendee, Teresa Chance, has said in our Q&A, about do we need to start by re-educating our own sons and daughters to see the value of family and parenthood? In other words, is the onus on us, or is it on the state to do something about this and to change the way our children, our growing children, see relationships, the way they see them, that has helped produce phenomena such as Love Island, perhaps?
Okay, I think the first thing to say is, this was, as a session, we're not supposed to be talking about the state, we're supposed to be talking about the family, and yet somehow the state keeps coming up. And I was noticing a comment from Jeff Knott in the chat about a program in Jacksonville, Florida, in the US that he says, and I have no reason to doubt him, reduced the divorce rate by 1/3 in people participating in this program, or even in Jacksonville as a whole. And it was run through community organizations, and particularly through churches. And that's really what I want to see in the common good, is from the bottom up, from organizations that are supportive, where the people know each other or can get to know each other, where we don't develop gigantic bureaucracies, the family development bureaucracy, which is often very, the government approach, for reasons that are both good and bad, is often antithetical to the kind of intimacy that the family needs to be supported, because each couple has its own story. And I guess the sort of the earlier question, I would only add to Mercy's comment a little bit of a caveat on relationships, that if you see the family as a kind of thing, a web, then where the generations interact and where people have a lot of mutual responsibilities, if that's the message that we give to our children, and I'll come back to this in a second, then it's not exactly a relationship that breaks down that you're worrying about. It's that you're breaking this web of family. And I think people can be more committed to their families when they see that as what they're doing. We're building a family rather than, do I and my wife or do I and my husband have a successful relationship? The question is, are we building a family? And when it comes to educating our children on this, yes, the earlier you start, the better. The Catholic Church teaches that the remote preparation for marriage starts when they're 2 or 4 or something. That's when you try and teach people what the structure of love and support and responsibility is. And if they have that before they're 20, they're a lot more likely to keep it and to build their lives around those values than they are if we try and teach it to them when they're already married or thinking about marriage. And Love Island is, I mean, I have not watched Love Island, but I get the idea. It's discouraging, but if you encourage people to think of romance as being about sex and not about marriage, then that's what you're going to get. And I think we have to think really deeply about how you change a lot of values to really improve the situation, which is not to say I'm opposed to the reforms that Cristina is promoting. Not at all. It's just, I like to emphasize, and I think Mercy, we're all in agreement that these are pretty profound cultural problems we have, and it will need a lot of work, not the kind of thing that the government can be trusted to do.
Well, thank you, Edward. And of course, I take that very seriously, what you said about the default position tending to lean towards discussion about the state. And I'm sorry if I have taken it that way myself at all, but that leads us very nicely into the most upvoted question of the night so far, which I'll ask Cristina if you could have first go at this one. But it's a very interesting one, I think, that everyone will have a view on. Why do the panelists think that the Catholic Church, along with other churches, has next to nothing to say about the family and the common good? Brexit, the environment, international development, yes, but the family? When was the last time you heard someone in a leadership position in the church argue that one of the most effective anti-poverty strategies is supporting the married family? Cristina?
I think that's really interesting. I think that with the exception of that quote that I love from Pope Francis, it's not St. Francis yet.
The canonization there.
Yeah. I love that quote, but you're right. The family is not being defended, is not being hailed by the church or by any of the churches enough. And I do wonder whether they too have become as squeamish, as reluctant to enter the domestic arena as our governments have. And that makes me sad because, we should be led spiritually, not socially or politically by our church. Is there anything that mitigates against it? Is there anything that we could do to remind our church that actually this is the fundamental rock upon which society can be built? I don't know. I think it's a really, really good question, and unfortunately, I feel as despondent about this one as Mercy feels about government.
Terry Mattinson has also asked in the questions, when are the Catholic Church going to give real support to families in a real challenge to this Tory government with austerity killing the family, having to use food banks and so on? Mercy, have you any views on the church's role? Does it have one, an effective one in supporting the family?
I think, it has to, if things are to work. I'm completely against sort of relying on the state to provide. I'm a small state kind of girl, basically, and I don't think we should trust the state to raise a family. We should rely on other civil society or not rely on, but we should encourage other civil society institutions to champion the idea of the family. I grew up in a Christian household, and I think the church was very much seen almost as an extension of the family, and the church family was almost a family in and of itself. And so sadly, the church does not take on the significance in society, particularly amongst my generation, that it once did, perhaps. But I'm more for sort of encouraging civil society institutions to take the lead, because they're made up of ordinary people, usually, in a way that the state is not.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting because it's very difficult not to return to the role of the state in this, because as one of our speakers did say, at one time, welfare benefits seemed to support the family, but now they almost seem to do the opposite in some respects. And Edward Adamus has asked a question. The Centre for Social Justice produced the excellent Breakdown Britain and Breakthrough Britain. Could we revisit the pro-family recommendations of the Breakthrough Britain report? He's from Fertile Heart. Cristina, I guess that's your area, really.
When you say revisit, should we be doing the research all over again to see whether it still applies? Because Breakdown Britain was a few years back, but certainly the main tenet of Breakdown Britain was, watch out, what family breakdown does is have an incredible impact on the next generation, and it did show in its surveys how if a child comes from a broken family, how they're twice as likely to end up with mental health problems, with in debt, in prison, and just absolutely at the very bottom of the pile. And this is why, when Edward said the middle classes have, because they've adopted are much more than the disadvantaged families, the model of marriage, they stand to benefit from the stability, from the prosperity that comes from the stability that marriage gives. And that is one of the key points for the Centre for Social Justice. Marriage is the best, not family, but marriage is the best insurance against poverty. And this is especially true if you're a woman.
Well, an anonymous attendee has just pointed out that the Church of England has just launched a commission into families, although for years and years all the churches have been reticent about promoting the family, and they wonder why that is. But Edward, I'd like to ask you, it is very difficult to keep the state out of this because, just practical things like Joanne Weatherall asks in the questions, don't later and later retirements and access to pensions preclude the intergenerational care that people are espousing, and the other societal engagement and support that used to all be possible and has now become increasingly difficult, along with the higher cost of living and so forth? Isn't so much of this down to the state, in fact, whether we like it or not?
Sure, but the state is, in many ways, it expresses the will of the people. And when you have systems that are so deeply embedded, as the state has developed over many decades now, the welfare state starts now 60, 70 years ago and has developed in these directions. I think that trying to do more than marginal changes in the state is unlikely to have much effect unless we can actually change the way that voters and people who eventually shape the state think about things. And I think there's an important principle in Catholic social teaching of subsidiarity, which argues that the state should support these organizations and families and so forth, that the lower, closer to the people, the stronger the organization will be. And yes, I want the state to do that. But if it's not going to do that, and it's not going to do that right now, then we have to work around it, behind it, to make the networks of the families, I talked about as a sort of web of family relationships, stronger. And I just want to get back to that question that I didn't get to answer because you didn't ask me about the churches. And just to underline, the Catholic Church has wonderful teaching about the family. Saint John Paul II, he is a saint, as compared to Francis, our current Pope, who may well be in due course. He wrote Familiaris Consortio. It's a brilliant document. And more recently, if you can take all the hundreds of pages, Amoris Laetitia is a wonderful document full of lovely things to say about the family and how important it is. And so the question isn't really whether the teaching is there. The teaching is definitely there. It's whether it's developed, and this is important. In my book on Catholic social teaching, I include 2 out of the 11 chapters are about the family teaching, because social teaching is incomplete without the family, and right now social teaching is hopeless without the family, because the family's got to be the basis. The family, the extended family, the web of family, it's got to be the basis of a healthy society, especially when the government is unlikely to budge in its commitment to anti-family policies until the families themselves are crying out loudly enough for change.
And can we enlarge on that a little bit, Edward? Because we've got a related question from Duncan McInnes of Marriage Prep in a Day. And he says, do you agree that one of the best ways to support successful family life, he's addressing all the panel as well, if you could start. Do you agree that one of the best ways to support successful family life is for marriages to be happy and successful? If so, couldn't the government help all new marriages right from the start have strong foundations by making available excellent online relationship advice? Also by making couples aware of existing inspirational marriage preparation courses?
I've been involved in marriage preparation for over the years, and sure, I'm all in favor of it. I would say, I don't like the way that we just move on to the state there right away, that question. And B, I think one of the things we should learn about is how marriages can be unhappy. That an unhappy marriage may not be necessarily the worst thing for the family. And I used to tell this story when I was doing marriage preparation of a couple that said, we almost got divorced. We had 10 years, we barely spoke to each other, but now we're happy again. And I think one of the ways that we fail children is by taking a lot of emphasis on the happiness of parents as they measure it themselves, rather than on their commitment to the family and seeing family as a project. So I don't disagree entirely with that. I mean, I'd rather have happy families than unhappy families. But I think one of the lessons you need to have is the idea that families are sometimes unhappy in ways that can be survived and actually eventually help them thrive.
So I cannot even begin to tell you how angry that made me. Edward, how could you possibly think that it is good for a child to be raised by an unhappy, angry couple that for 10 years has been, smoldering with rage and fury and contempt for one another? I mean, I'm sorry, that is absolutely not something that can ever be good as an environment to raise a child. Of course I believe in the family, of course I believe in marriage, but when things get to that stage, forget it.
Fair enough, but I mean, you have to figure out what the story means and what it's about. But yes, I mean that's perfectly fair. There are times when having parents together is bad, and we should try and help them to be together. But my basic point is that marriage involves sacrifices, and families involve sacrifices, and sometimes that involves being unhappy. It doesn't necessarily involve fighting and smoldering. It just can be there. If we set too high a standard of happiness within the family, I think that's a problem. So we can disagree on that.
Cristina, I made a slight mistake in an earlier question from Edmund Adamus when I referred to breakdown Britain. And in fact, he says his question was about breakthrough Britain, which has very strong practical recommendations. So sorry about that mistake, but I think what your response to the question was still very interesting, I thought.
But can I just pick up, Edward, you've gone from being my favorite panelist to my least favorite now. Edward, there was another thing that you said, which was about the teachings of the church. And of course, the encyclicals and the teachings of the church are fantastic about family. But what touches us is not an encyclical. It's what the churches do, what the churches say. You know, every Sunday when we come to Mass, I want to hear something that is positive and strengthening and inspiring for the family. And I don't. I fail, you know, I'm trying to remember when I last heard a homily that really inspired me in my role as a parent, my role as a wife. And I think the churches have been very, very silent on this.
Oh, I completely agree with you. I can move up your rankings a little bit. No, I certainly agree that these teachings have not been translated at all. And when I talk to priests about it, they seem really oblivious to the issue, you know, lip service, and it's not merely because they're celibate, it's because somehow the culture that they grow up in or that they are trained in and the world that they live in is there. Okay, Jenny wants us to talk about fatherhood. So I'm going to actually move on and talk about fatherhood in the few minutes that are left. And then hopefully someone else will say something more intelligent than I do and less controversial. Fatherhood's really important. And one of the really peculiar things of the modern age is that we have better fatherhood than we've ever had in terms of active parent fathers, you know, changing nappies, involved in the decisions about childcare in a way that was almost unheard of 40 or 50 years ago, and certainly unheard of 60 or 70 years ago. And so in some ways, we have better fathering than we ever have. But as Mercy has pointed out, and Christine, we also have worse fatherhood than we ever had, in the sense that fathers feel free to leave. Often they don't even stick around from the very beginning of the child's life. And they feel often, sometimes the commitments of work are themselves very burdensome, and that's a social issue. But fatherhood needs to be explored and enhanced and protected at every level, and so that more children can benefit from what is good about contemporary fatherhood.
Thank you for that. That was really important. And also I think it would be interesting to discuss subsidiarity a little bit. We've had a good question about subsidiarity. We've also had a very good question from Adrian Lowe, network leader and community lead in Dudley, who asks whether our current education system mitigates against the family in any way, because it seems to have a focus, he says, on producing a viable, productive unit for our commodity-led world. Mercy, do you have any thoughts about that and about education and the way it's shaping the next generations in a commodity-led world?
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think the state education system fails children on so many levels, too many levels to get into here. But I'm not sure. So schools have very much tried to integrate relationships and, you know, sex and relationship into the curriculum. I haven't looked in detail at the materials they use, but I have. Sometimes controversies pop up, let's say, in the media about the sorts of things they are teaching and whether parents should sort of get the right of refusal, so to speak, for that. I think there's a focus now perhaps on issues of sex and gender and things like that, whereas before we even get to that, there should be really a focus on relationships in a more holistic way, rather than just, you know, what bits somebody has and what sexual preference they have and things like that. I do think there is scope to teach about, you know, some might say it's too young, but to teach about families and to teach about relationships that isn't so focused on the physical side and the sexual side of relationships.
And as an anonymous attendee's pointed out, you know, for the common good to happen, subsidiarity is one of the key principles that is required. And so we're close to coming to the end of the webinar, but it'd be very interesting to have a few words from each of you about sort of, the role of the family in terms of where responsibility for the common good through subsidiarity could happen. Cristina, would you like to kick us off on that?
Well, I think that when we look at the family unit, it is as much a personification of the principle of subsidiarity. What we have is the smallest, the most basic, the most localized grassroots template for a good society. And from there, everything else can go up. And I agree with both Edward and Mercy. This is where the state really doesn't have a role.
Edward, would you, what you said about fathers was really important, and thank you so much for raising that, because that's absolutely vital, of course, and it has been a neglected theme throughout society, really, in so many respects, the importance of the father. Can you relate that at all to subsidiarity and the common good?
Sure. I mean, the subsidiarity, the notion that the family is the building block of society. One of the ideas of fatherhood is as a representative of the family, not just as a father, but as in some ways connected to the world with the family. And that's an idea that we really lost touch with. And this isn't to say that mothers and other members of the family are not also connected with the world, but the role of the father as in some ways a protector and just trying to think about gender roles in a way that's much more helpful than we do now is part of subsidiarity, and something we should think about more. And this brings again other parts of the subsidiary structure. The churches and so forth should have a larger role in trying to help us understand relationships, families, all of that together.
And Mercy, when we talk about subsidiarity and the family, that also, of course, does lead naturally into the idea of intergeneration, the importance of intergenerational families and mutual support through that structure. And we have got a question about social care and respect for elders, and that probably would include the importance of respecting fathers in there as well as mothers. And how do you feel that we're doing on that front?
I know we don't have long, so I mean, what I would say is fundamentally, fathers, I think, are probably the most important groups in society. So the more we can do to support fathers, I think it will just trickle down to the rest of society, and that's particularly the case for these groups of children, particularly those ethnic groups. That 63% of Caribbean kids, for example, who are growing up in a lone parent household, predominantly, obviously, single parents. So I think we would see a lot of social issues resolved very quickly if we put fathers at the center of relationships and at the center of families, and started valuing fathers and men as fathers in a way that we don't.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for a really terrific conversation. And before we go, let's have a quick look at the next two events in the series. You can find full details on the Together for the Common Good website and the St Mary's websites, and we'll put links in the chat. But just briefly to share with you the great set of speakers we have lined up for you moving on. Number 3 is on Wednesday, the 29th of September, on the Common Good and Society, with David Goodhart, Trevor Phillips, Lord Said Kamal and Dame Julia Unwin, chaired by Richard Harries. And the fourth and final event in this series is on the Common Good and Government on Tuesday, the 16th of November, with Danny Kruger MP, Lord Maurice Glassman and Caroline Slowcock, chaired by Ruth Kelly. This one, we hope, will be in person. We really hope you can join us for these conversations. Do tell your friends and colleagues and spread the word. A recording of this event will be on our website shortly, so do feel free to share as widely as you like. And if you haven't seen it, do watch the first event in the series, The Common Good, What Does It Mean? So on behalf of our partners, thank you to our speakers, Edward, Mercy and Cristina for a wonderful evening and a wonderful discussion. I'm just sorry we didn't have time to talk more and to hear more. Thank you to our sponsor, CCLA, and especially to all of you in the audience for your participation. Goodbye and see you next time.